In the glittering lobby of a luxury hotel, an arrogant crime boss strutted in like he owned the city, snapping orders and tossing insults at the quiet maid who dared to cross his path. She kept her eyes down, hands trembling around a cart of spotless sheets, swallowing every cruel word as the staff watched in frozen silence. To him, she was invisible, another powerless worker to humiliate for sport. What he couldn't see were the bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, the steady breathing of someone trained to take hits and never flinch, and the calm that comes from winning fights no one is supposed to know exist. When his temper finally spills over and he decides to teach her a lesson, the air shifts. The hotel's bright lights feel colder, the hallway narrows and fear changes sides. Because the meek woman he mocked isn't fragile, she's undefeated where it counts. The emergency alarm screamed through the marble corridors of the Nightglass Hotel at 3:17 a.m., its sharp cry cutting through the thick silence that usually wrapped around New York's most exclusive establishment. Glass shattered somewhere on the 42nd floor. Heavy footsteps thundered across Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes. Mara Bellucci pressed herself against the service elevator wall, her cleaning cart rattling as the building shook. Through her thick-rimmed glasses, she watched red emergency lights paint the hallway in violent strokes. Her oversized uniform hung loose on her small frame, making her look even more invisible than usual. The night shift at the Nightglass had always been quiet, a world of whispered conversations behind mahogany doors, champagne glasses clinking in private suites, and secrets traded like currency. Not tonight. A man stumbled past her hiding spot, blood trickling from his temple, his expensive suit torn at the shoulder. She recognized him. Mason Falco, one of the hotel's most frequent VIP guests, the kind who treated staff like furniture and never bothered to learn their names. Behind him came another figure, tall and composed despite the chaos, Bruno Altieri, whose quiet presence always seemed to fill whatever room he entered. "The penthouse," Bruno said, his voice steady as stone. "Now!" Mason's hand shook as he pressed it to his wound. They came from nowhere. How did they know? Questions later. Bruno's dark eyes swept the corridor, cataloguing every shadow, every possible threat. For a fraction of a second, his gaze passed over Mara's hiding spot. She held her breath, heart hammering against her ribs. The elevator chimed softly, its polished doors sliding open to reveal another man. Even in the emergency lighting, Dante Vescari commanded attention effortlessly. He stepped into the hallway with the measured confidence of someone who owned whatever ground his feet touched. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the only signs that the night had touched him at all. "Status," he said simply. "The Gallo?" Bruno replied. Kieran Voss led the assault. They took the 38th floor. Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The name carried weight here, in this world of unspoken hierarchies and blood-drawn boundaries. Mara had heard whispers about the gallows during her months cleaning these halls, fragments of conversations that guests never realized the help could hear. "Casualties?" Dante asked. "None of ours. Yet." Bruno glanced toward the stairwell where shadows moved behind frosted glass. "But they're not here for the hotel." Mason wiped blood from his face with a trembling hand. "They want... I know what they want." Dante's voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made grown men step back without realizing why. He looked at Mason with something that might have been disappointment or might have been calculation. "The question is why they think they can take it." The building shuddered again, and this time Mara heard breaking glass much closer. 20 floors down, maybe 15. Her fingers gripped the edge of her cart as she tried to make herself smaller, tried to become the kind of invisible she'd spent months perfecting in this place. "Sir." Bruno's voice carried a new urgency. "We need to move." But Dante wasn't looking toward the elevators or the emergency stairs. His attention had shifted to something else entirely, a sound that didn't belong in the chaos. Mara followed his gaze and saw what he saw, a security camera hanging at an angle, its red recording light still blinking. Even in the middle of an attack, someone was watching, someone was recording. "They're not just here to take," Dante said quietly. "They're here to be seen taking." The realization hit the hallway like a physical force. This wasn't just violence, it was theater. The kind of public demonstration that changed everything, that shifted power in ways that couldn't be undone with money or influence or whispered threats. Dante straightened, and Mara watched something harden in his expression. The reluctant air she'd observed from the shadows over the past months was gone, replaced by something sharper, more dangerous. He'd inherited an empire he never wanted, but tonight the empire was choosing him, whether he was ready or not. "Bruno," he said, his voice carrying new steel. "Clear the stairwell. Mason, you're with me. We end this now." As they moved toward the emergency exit, Mara caught a glimpse of Dante's profile in the shifting light. There was something in his face that reminded her of herself, the look of someone who'd been forced to become something they never planned to be, the look of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes meant embracing the very thing you'd spent your life running from. The emergency lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Somewhere in the distance sirens wailed, but Mara knew they wouldn't arrive in time to matter. Whatever was happening here tonight would be decided by the people already inside these walls. She pressed deeper into the shadows of her hiding spot, her heart still racing, and wondered if she was about to witness the birth of a war or the end of everything the Nightglass Hotel had ever been. Hey there! Thanks for being here. Hit like and tell me in the comments what you thought of the story and what city you're watching from. Now, let's jump back in. 3 weeks before the attack, Mara Bellucci stood in the laundry room of the Nightglass Hotel at 2 a.m., steam rising from industrial washing machines like ghosts in the fluorescent light. Her hands moved automatically, folding, sorting, pressing, while her mind calculated numbers that never seemed to add up right. Rent was due in 5 days. The medical bills sat in a pile on her kitchen table, growing thicker each month like some malevolent creature feeding on her fear. She pulled off her thick glasses and rubbed her eyes, allowing herself 30 seconds of exhaustion before sliding the frames back into place. The prescription was deliberately wrong, strong enough to make her squint, weak enough to let her see what she needed to see. Everything about Mara Bellucci was deliberately wrong, carefully constructed to make her forgettable. The overnight cleaning shift paid double what day work offered, and the Nightglass guests tipped well when they noticed the help at all. Most nights, she was invisible, exactly how she preferred it. She'd learned to read the rhythm of the building, to know which corridors would be empty at which hours, to disappear into the background like wallpaper. Her phone buzzed against her hip. The display showed a number she recognized, and her stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. "Nonna?" she answered, keeping her voice low. "Cara mia." Her grandmother's voice sounded smaller than usual, fragile in a way that made Mara's chest tight. "I'm sorry to call so late. The pain, I'm coming." Mara was already moving, untying her apron with one hand. 20 minutes. The subway ride to Bensonhurst felt endless, every stop a reminder of how far she'd traveled from the person she used to be. The train car smelled of industrial disinfectant and late-night desperation. A homeless man dozed in the corner, his shopping cart loaded with everything he owned. Mara understood that feeling, the weight of carrying your entire world with you, never knowing where you might have to run next. Her grandmother's apartment building looked exactly like what it was. Subsidized housing for people who'd worked their entire lives and still couldn't afford to live with dignity. The elevator wheezed between floors, graffiti covering its metal walls in languages Mara could read, but pretended not to understand. She found Nonna sitting in her recliner, the one luxury in a living room furnished with decades-old pieces and photographs of a family mostly scattered or gone. Eleanor Bellucci had raised Mara after her parents died in a car accident when she was 8. She'd been a seamstress then, her fingers quick and sure with needle and thread. Now those same hands shook with arthritis and the pills that might help cost more than her pension allowed. "The doctor says I need the surgery," Nonna said without preamble. She'd never been one to soften bad news. "My hip, without it." She didn't need to finish. They both knew what came next. A wheelchair, then a bed, then the kind of care facilities that smelled like disinfectant and defeat. Mara had visited enough of them during her grandmother's previous hospital stays to know what $20,000 could buy. Dignity, proper care, a chance to keep living instead of just surviving. "We'll figure it out," Mara said, settling onto the arm of the chair. Her grandmother's hand found hers, papery skin warm against her palm. "You already do too much, Kara. I see the shadows under your eyes. You think I don't know you work 2 jobs?" Mara squeezed gently. Nonna knew about the hotel cleaning position, but not about the weekend shifts she picked up at a gym in Queens, mopping floors and organizing equipment for fighters who reminded her of everything she'd left behind. The familiar ache of old bruises seemed to throb in response to the memory. "I have savings," she lied, "and I have eyes." Nonna's voice carried the authority of someone who'd raised a granddaughter through stubbornness and love alone. "You think I don't recognize the walk? The way you move your shoulders? I was married to your grandfather for 43 years, remember?" Mara's breath caught. Nonno had been a boxer in Italy before the war changed everything. He'd taught Mara to throw a punch when she was 12, after a group of boys at school decided the quiet girl with thick glasses made an easy target. She'd never told him how natural it felt, how the combinations came to her like remembered music. "That was different," Mara said. "Was it?" Nonna's dark eyes studied her granddaughter's face. "You have his hands, you know. The same knuckles. The same scars you think I don't notice." They sat in comfortable silence while the radiator clanked and the city hummed beyond thin windows. Mara calculated and recalculated, but the numbers never changed. 20,000 for the surgery, 3,000 for rent and utilities, food, medications, the endless small emergencies that came with taking care of someone who refused to admit she needed taking care of. "I'll find a way," Mara said finally. "Not the old way," Nonna said quietly. "Promise me." Mara nodded, but they both knew promises were fragile things. In the morning, she'd return to the Nightglass Hotel, disappear into her uniform and her carefully constructed invisibility. But tonight, holding her grandmother's hand in the dim light of a tiny apartment, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be powerful, to be feared, to be someone who could change everything with her fists. The old way was the only way she'd ever really known how to solve problems, that money and patience couldn't touch. Dante Viscari had learned to read silence the way other men read newspapers. In the penthouse suite of the Nightglass Hotel, silence meant respect, fear, or death, sometimes all 3. This morning's silence, however, carried something different as he stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. The city sprawled below him like a chessboard, where he'd inherited all the pieces but none of the strategies. His father's funeral had been 3 months ago, the will reading 2 weeks after that, the transfer of power, a slow bleed of obligations and enemies that had followed him from the cemetery to this moment. Standing in a room that still smelled faintly of his father's cigars and old leather. "The Colombo situation requires your attention." Bruno Altieri's voice came from behind him, measured and careful. Bruno had been his father's right hand for 15 years, which made him either the most trustworthy man in Dante's orbit or the most dangerous. The jury was still out. Dante didn't turn from the window. "Handle it." "It requires your attention," Bruno repeated, and this time Dante heard the emphasis. There were things Bruno could do, and things that required the Viscari name attached to them. The weight of legacy pressed against Dante's shoulders like a physical force. He'd never wanted this. During his father's lifetime, Dante had kept himself deliberately distant from the family business, pursuing an MBA at Wharton, working in legitimate investment firms, building a life that touched the Viscari empire only at Christmas dinners and mandatory family gatherings. He'd convinced himself he could stay clean, stay separate. Then Antonio Viscari had a heart attack at 62, and suddenly Dante was standing in boardrooms where handshakes meant life and death, inheriting relationships built on fear and maintained through violence he'd spent his adult life trying to avoid. "Schedule it," he said finally, "but not here. The warehouse in Queens." Bruno made a note in the leather portfolio he carried everywhere, his movements precise and economical. "Mason Falco has been asking to see you, something about the dock operations." At the mention of Mason's name, something cold settled in Dante's chest. Mason was useful, aggressive, loyal to whoever held power, willing to do things that kept other people's hands clean. He was also volatile, unpredictable, the kind of man who saw solutions in terms of force rather than strategy. Dante's father had valued Mason's particular skill set. Dante was still deciding whether that made Mason an asset or a liability. What about the dock operations? Revenue is down 30%. Mason thinks someone's skimming. Dante finally turned from the window. Bruno stood near the mahogany desk that had belonged to 3 generations of Vescari men, his posture formal but relaxed. Dark suit immaculate despite the early hour, everything about Bruno suggested competence, control, loyalty. But Dante had learned not to trust appearances, especially his own. "What do you think?" Dante asked. "I think Mason sees problems that require his kind of solutions." Bruno's tone was carefully neutral. "I also think the dock revenues have been declining for 6 months, which predates any possible theft." It was a diplomatic way of saying Mason was wrong, potentially dangerously so. Dante appreciated the subtlety, even as he recognized the test embedded in it. Bruno was watching to see how the new boss handled competing advice, whether he'd default to violence or strategy when pressure mounted. "Set up a meeting," Dante said. "All 3 of us. I want to hear Mason's concerns directly." "Of course." Bruno closed the portfolio. "There's one more thing. The monthly rotation of security staff is due. Some of the overnight personnel have been here longer than standard protocol recommends." Dante raised an eyebrow. His father had been paranoid about long-term employees, people who might develop loyalties beyond the paycheck, who might see too much, remember too much. Regular turnover kept the help invisible and temporary. "Anyone specific?" "No one concerning. Kitchen staff, housekeeping, maintenance. The usual turnover will handle it." But as Bruno spoke, Dante's mind drifted to something else, a memory from the previous week that had been nagging at him. He'd been leaving a late meeting when he'd glimpsed one of the cleaning staff in the hallway. Something about her posture had caught his attention, the way she'd moved between shadows with too much awareness, too much control. When he'd looked directly at her, she'd seemed to shrink, becoming instantly forgettable, except he hadn't forgotten. "The cleaning staff," he said slowly. "How long do they typically work here?" 6 months, maybe 8 before rotation. Why? Dante wasn't sure why. It was instinct more than logic, the same feeling that had kept him alive through 3 months of navigating his father's enemies and allies. Something about the woman in the hallway had felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but wrong in the way a perfectly forged painting was wrong. Too good, too careful, too much like exactly what it was supposed to be. "Nothing specific," he said. "Just thinking about security." Bruno nodded and headed for the door, but Dante's attention had already returned to the window, to the city below, where millions of people moved through their lives wearing masks, pretending to be someone other than who they really were. He understood the feeling. The VIP antechamber on the 42nd floor reeked of expensive cologne and territorial dominance. Dante sat in the leather chair that commanded the room's attention, watching Mason Falco pace behind the bar like a caged animal, looking for something to break. The meeting about dock revenues had devolved into Mason's usual grievances about respect and territory, punctuated by increasingly aggressive gestures with his whiskey glass. "Someone's stealing from us," Mason said for the 3rd time, his voice thick with alcohol and frustration. "I can feel it. 20 years in this business, I know when I'm being played." Bruno remained silent in the corner, his presence a study in controlled patience. Dante had learned to read Bruno's silences. This one suggested Mason was drunk enough to be dangerous, but not drunk enough to be dismissed. "Feelings aren't evidence," Dante said quietly. Mason's face flushed red. "Your father would have—" "My father is dead." The words cut through the room like a blade. Dante stood slowly, his movement precise and deliberate. "Which means you work for me now, and I don't make decisions based on paranoia and bourbon." The silence that followed vibrated with tension. Mason's jaw worked as if he were chewing glass, his knuckles white around his drink. Bruno shifted almost imperceptibly, ready to intervene if necessary. The soft knock at the door broke the moment. Dante glanced at his watch. 2:47 a.m. The overnight cleaning crew, right on schedule. "Enter," he called. Mara Bellucci slipped through the door like smoke, her cleaning cart barely making a sound on the plush carpet. She kept her eyes down, her movements efficient and unobtrusive as she began collecting glasses from the meeting table. Dante watched her work, that same nagging sense of wrongness flickering in his mind. Mason's attention fixed on her with predatory interest. The alcohol had made him mean, and he needed someone to take his frustration out on, someone who couldn't fight back. "Hey!" Mason called out, his voice loud in the quiet room. "You, girl!" Mara looked up briefly, her thick glasses reflecting the low lighting. "Sir? Those glasses make you look like a librarian who gave up." Mason laughed at his own joke, emboldened by the whiskey and his audience. "Take them off. Let's see what we're working with." Dante watched the exchange with detached interest. This was Mason at his worst, petty, cruel, needing to assert dominance over anyone he perceived as weaker. It was also a test, though Mason didn't realize it. How Dante handled this moment would say everything about the kind of leader he intended to be. "I'm sorry, sir, I need them to see," Mara said quietly, continuing to clear the table. "I wasn't asking." Mason moved closer, reaching for her glasses. "I was telling." Mara stepped back, but Mason followed. His hand caught the frames, pulling them from her face with enough force to make her stumble. Without the thick lenses, her features changed completely. Sharper, more defined. The bone structure of someone who'd learned to take hits and keep moving. "Much better," Mason said, holding the glasses up to the light mockingly. "Amazing what you find when you strip away the disguise." That's when Dante saw it, a flash of something dangerous in her eyes gone so quickly he almost missed it. For half a second, Mara Bellucci looked like someone who could kill a man with her bare hands. Then the mask slipped back into place, and she was just a frightened cleaning girl again. Mason, oblivious to the moment he'd almost created, was reaching for her chin when his elbow knocked against the champagne bottle on the side table. Dom Perignon, 1996, a gift from a business associate worth more than most people made in a month. The bottle tumbled, its contents spraying across the Persian rug and splashing onto Dante's Italian leather shoes. The room went dead silent. Mason's face went pale as he realized what had happened. Bruno straightened, his hand moving fractionally closer to his jacket. Mara froze, the glasses still in Mason's grip, her cleaning cloth forgotten in her hand. Dante looked down at his ruined shoes, then at the spreading stain on the antique rug, then at Mason's terrified expression. The moment stretched like a held breath. "Well," Dante said finally, his voice conversational, "that presents an interesting problem." "Boss, Mason started. "The bottle was a gift from Don Stefano Ruggieri. The rug belonged to my grandfather, the shoes." Dante examined the damage with theatrical deliberation. "Italian calfskin, custom made." Mason swallowed hard. "I'll replace everything, whatever it costs. Replacement isn't the issue." Dante's gaze moved to Mara, still standing frozen between them. "The issue is respect. You disrespected my property, my space, and my time. That requires—" He paused, seeming to consider. "Satisfaction." Bruno's eyebrows raised slightly. This wasn't how Dante usually handled things. "Here's what's going to happen," Dante continued, his tone casual despite the weight of his words. "The hotel has a private boxing ring in the basement. Old tradition from my grandfather's time. You're going to go 3 rounds with Miss." He looked at Mara expectantly. "Bellucci," she whispered. "Miss Bellucci. If she can last 3 minutes without being knocked down, your debt is paid. If she can't—" Dante shrugged. "You handle it your way, away from the cameras." Mason's relief was palpable. 3 minutes against a terrified cleaning girl. It was almost insulting how easy Dante was making this. "And if I refuse?" Mara asked, her voice barely audible. Dante's smile held no warmth. "You don't get to refuse. The only choice you have is how this ends." Mara looked at Mason, then at Bruno, then finally at Dante. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Calculation, memory, recognition of a crossroads she'd hoped never to see again. 3 minutes, she said quietly. 3 minutes, Dante confirmed. As they prepared to leave for the basement, Dante caught Bruno's questioning look. He had no idea why he'd made this choice, why he was curious enough about a cleaning girl to risk Mason's volatile temper in an enclosed space. But something told him the next 3 minutes would change everything. The basement of the Night Glass Hotel existed in a different century. Exposed brick walls, sweated with decades of ambition and violence, while overhead bulbs cast harsh shadows across a boxing ring that had seen more blood than most emergency rooms. The smell was primal: leather, sweat, and the metallic tang of old victories and defeats. Mara stood at the edge of the ring, her uniform feeling like a costume she'd forgotten how to wear. Without her glasses, the world had sharp edges again, details that cut through her carefully constructed blindness. She could see the stains on the canvas, the way Mason Falco rolled his shoulders as he stripped off his jacket, the calculating interest in Dante Viscari's dark eyes as he watched from ringside. "Just 3 minutes," Mason said, bouncing on his toes like a man 20 years younger. "Try not to make it too easy." Bruno Altieri checked his watch with military precision. The silence stretched until it became a living thing, heavy with expectation and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. "Time," Bruno called. Mason came forward with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight against someone half his size. His first swing was lazy, telegraphed, meant to intimidate rather than damage. Mara ducked under it, her movement economical and precise, muscle memory overriding months of careful acting. For 20 seconds, she played the part, stumbled backward, raised her hands in clumsy defense, let Mason's punches whistle past her face by inches that looked like luck rather than skill. She could feel Dante's attention like a weight on her shoulders, studying every movement, cataloguing every mistake that wasn't quite a mistake. Then Mason got careless. His right cross came in wide and slow, and instead of dodging, Mara slipped inside his guard. Her elbow found his solar plexus with surgical precision, driving the air from his lungs in a whoosh of surprise and pain. As he doubled over, gasping, her knee came up toward his chin. She stopped herself a quarter-inch from impact. The basement went silent except for Mason's labored breathing and the distant hum of the hotel's ventilation system. Mara stepped back, her stance shifting automatically into something that belonged in European underground circuits, not New York hotel basements. "Interesting," Dante said quietly. Mason straightened slowly, his face red with humiliation and lack of oxygen. "You little—" "Time," Bruno called, though barely 90 seconds had passed. But Mason wasn't listening. He lunged forward with genuine anger now, his punch aimed at Mara's temple with enough force to do real damage. She moved like water, redirecting his momentum until he crashed into the ring post with a sound that made everyone wince. Dante was on his feet before Mason hit the canvas. "Enough!" His voice carried absolute authority. Mason rolled over, blood trickling from his nose, his eyes unfocused. "Bruno, get him medical attention." As Bruno helped Mason toward the basement exit, Dante stepped closer to the ring. Mara stood in the center, her breathing controlled, her posture relaxed but ready. Without the oversized uniform and thick glasses, she looked like someone who could dismantle grown men for sport. "Berlin," Dante said conversationally. "Mihai Stănescu, the underground circuit at Kreuzberg." Mara's face went carefully blank. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The Iron Siren, also called the Ash Widow if memory serves, undefeated in 47 professional bouts before she vanished without explanation." Dante climbed through the ropes, moving with casual confidence into what was clearly her territory. "Interpol has been looking for you for 3 years. You're mistaken." "Am I?" Dante studied her face in the harsh light. "Because the woman who just put Mason Falco on the floor moves exactly like someone who once fought Stănescu to a standstill in front of 2,000 screaming degenerates." Mara said nothing, but her silence was confirmation enough. "Here's what I think happened," Dante continued, beginning to circle her slowly. "You got tired of being a commodity, tired of having your fights bought and sold by people who saw you as a revenue stream rather than a person. So you walked away from everything, the money, the reputation, the identity, and became invisible. Being invisible has advantages. Until tonight." Dante stopped directly in front of her. "Now you have a choice. I can call Interpol right now. They'd be very interested to know that the legendary Ash Widow is mopping floors in Manhattan. Or, you work for me. Your real skills, not your cleaning skills. Protection, enforcement, problem-solving that requires a particular kind of expertise. Mara laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to buy me. I want to employ you. There's a difference. What's the difference? Dante pulled out his phone, speed-dialed a number. Dr. Patricia Chen, this is Dante Viscari. I need you to clear your schedule tomorrow for a consultation. Hip replacement surgery, priority case. He paused, listening. Money is no object. Yes, I'll handle the arrangements personally. He hung up and looked at Mara. Your grandmother's surgery is scheduled for next week. Full recovery. Private room. Best orthopedic surgeon on the East Coast. Consider it a signing bonus. Mara's composure cracked for the first time. How do you... I make it my business to know things about people who interest me. Elena Bellucci, 73, arthritis. Medicare that covers about 30% of what she actually needs. You've been working yourself to death trying to afford treatment that should be a basic human right. And in exchange, you stay, you work. You do what I tell you to do, when I tell you to do it. No more hiding, no more pretending to be helpless, but also no more fighting for other people's entertainment. Mara looked around the basement, at the ring where she'd just destroyed 3 months of careful anonymity in 30 seconds. Her grandmother would have the surgery, would live with dignity instead of pain. But the price? What happens when you're done with me? That depends, Dante said, on how useful you prove to be. It wasn't a promise of freedom. It was barely a promise at all. But it was more than Mara had been offered in 3 years of running. I have conditions, she said. Name them. No one else dies because of what I can do. I solve problems. I don't create them. And if I ever want to walk away, you can't. That's the point. Dante's smile was sharp as broken glass. But I can make your captivity very comfortable. Mara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of inevitability settle on her shoulders like a familiar coat. When do I start? The suite on the 39th floor of the Night Glass Hotel was a study in contradictions, beautiful and sterile, luxurious and imprisoning. Mara stood at the wall of windows, watching Manhattan pulse with morning light while behind her, a breakfast service for 2 sat untouched on bone china that probably cost more than she'd made in a year of cleaning. 3 days since the basement. 3 days since everything changed. The apartment had appeared like magic. Dante's people had moved her belongings from her cramped studio while she was visiting Nonna at the hospital. Dr. Chen had performed the surgery with the precision of someone who charged accordingly, and Elena Bellucci was already walking with a physical therapist who spoke fluent Italian and charged by the hour. Everything Mara had wanted delivered with the efficiency that unlimited money could buy. The only cost was her identity. You haven't touched your food. Bruno Altieri's voice came from the doorway, measured and observant as always. He'd been assigned as her handler, though neither of them called it that, responsible for her transition from invisible employee to valued asset. Not hungry. Mara didn't turn from the window. Below, ordinary people moved through their ordinary lives, unaware that someone was watching them from a height that felt like another planet entirely. Bruno entered the room with the careful politeness of someone who understood the psychology of cages. Mr. Viscari wants to see you. Training facility, 10th floor. The training facility turned out to be a private gym that belonged in a professional boxing club rather than a hotel. Heavy bags hung from reinforced chains, speed bags weighted in perfect alignment, and a regulation ring dominated the center of the space. The smell was familiar, leather and liniment, sweat and ambition, but wrong somehow, too clean, too organized, missing the desperate edge that had defined every real gym Mara had ever known. Dante stood beside the ring wearing athletic clothes that looked like they'd been tailored specifically for him. Even dressed down, he carried himself with the unconscious authority of someone who'd never doubted his right to occupy any space he entered. Your grandmother is recovering well, he said without preamble. Dr. Chen says she'll be walking normally within 6 weeks. Thank you. The words came automatically, though Mara wasn't sure if gratitude was the right emotion for a debt that could never be repaid. Don't thank me yet. This is a business arrangement, not charity. Dante gestured toward the ring. Show me what you can really do. Against who? Me. Mara studied his face for signs of humor or arrogance, but found only cool assessment. You're not a fighter. No, but I need to understand what I'm working with. Dante began wrapping his hands with practiced efficiency. 3 months ago, I inherited an empire I never wanted, filled with people whose loyalty is measured in fear and self-interest. The old ways worked for my father, but they won't work for me. What does that have to do with putting you on the floor? Maybe nothing. Or maybe everything. Dante finished wrapping his hands and stepped through the ropes. The only way to lead people who solve problems with violence is to understand violence yourself. Mara followed him into the ring, her movements automatic despite the strangeness of the situation. She'd sparred with amateurs before, businessmen who thought money could buy them fighting skills, politicians who confused aggression with strength. It usually ended badly for them, but as Dante settled into his stance, Mara realized he wasn't entirely untrained. His guard was textbook correct, his footwork adequate if unimaginative. Someone had taught him the basics, probably the same expensive trainer who'd equipped this pristine gym. Rules? She asked. Until someone gets hurt. Dante's smile held no warmth. Try not to make it me. They circled each other cautiously, each testing the other's timing and distance. Dante threw a tentative jab that Mara slipped easily, countering with a light hook to his ribs that barely qualified as a tap. He absorbed it without flinching, resetting his guard with mechanical precision. For 2 minutes, they danced around each other in a careful simulation of combat. Dante's technique was competent, but predictable, the kind of boxing taught in expensive gyms to rich men who wanted to feel dangerous without risking genuine harm. Mara found herself bored, going through the motions of a fight that felt more like choreography. Then Dante changed tactics. Instead of boxing, he began to talk. "Tell me about Berlin," he said, throwing a combination that she deflected without effort. "What made you walk away from a career that most fighters would kill for?" "Private." Mara's counterpunch stopped an inch from his solar plexus. Was it the money, the violence, or something else? Dante pressed forward, forcing her to give ground. "Someone like you doesn't just disappear unless something breaks inside." "Someone like me?" The question came out sharper than Mara intended. "A weapon, a tool designed for a specific purpose." Dante's next punch came faster, with more intent behind it. "What happens when a weapon decides it doesn't want to be used anymore?" Mara's response was instinctive and immediate. She slipped inside his guard, her elbow finding the nerve cluster below his armpit with surgical precision. Dante's arm went numb instantly, his guard dropping as muscle control abandoned him. She could have ended it there. A knee to the liver, an uppercut to the chin, any of a dozen techniques that would have put him on the canvas in genuine pain. Instead, she stepped back, watching him flex his fingers as feeling slowly returned to his arm. "It finds something else to fight for," she said quietly. Dante lowered his hands, studying her with new interest. "Your grandmother?" "Among other things." "What other things?" Mara looked around the pristine gym, with its perfect equipment and climate-controlled air, its complete absence of the desperate hunger that drove real fighters, the right to choose who gets hurt and why. "And you think working for me gives you that choice?" "I think it gives me more choice than I've had in 3 years." Dante nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "Then we understand each other." But as Mara left the gym and returned to her beautiful prison on the 39th floor, she wondered if understanding and trust were the same thing. Outside her windows, the city continued its indifferent dance, and she felt the weight of her new life settling around her like expensive chains. The call came at 2 a.m., pulling Mara from the first decent sleep she'd had in weeks. Dante's voice on the secure line was steady, but carried an undercurrent she'd learned to recognize, controlled urgency that meant someone had made a serious mistake. "Warehouse in Queens. Bruno will drive you." 20 minutes later, she sat in the passenger seat of a black sedan, watching the city change from glass towers to industrial sprawl. Bruno Altieri drove with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else, navigating through empty streets, while classical music played softly from speakers that probably cost more than most people's cars. "What am I walking into?" Mara asked. "Negotiation gone wrong." Bruno's tone suggested the understatement was intentional. Mason was supposed to collect payment from the Torino family. Instead, he decided to make an example. Mara understood immediately. Mason Falco's idea of negotiation typically involved broken bones and hospital visits, the kind of crude intimidation that created more problems than it solved. Effective in the short term, catastrophic for long-term business relationships. The warehouse squatted between abandoned lots like a concrete tumor, its loading docks dark except for a single overhead light that cast harsh shadows across several expensive cars. Dante stood near a shipping container, his posture radiating the kind of calm that preceded either violence or very expensive solutions. Inside the container, Mason had zip-tied 3 men to chairs arranged in a neat row. The Torino representatives looked exactly like what they were, middle management in expensive suits who'd expected a routine business meeting and instead found themselves starring in their own kidnapping. Blood trickled from various facial injuries, and the air reeked of fear and industrial disinfectant. 48 hours, Mason was saying as Mara and Bruno approached. "That's what Mr. Vescari is giving you to find his money." "Mason!" Dante's voice cut through the threats like a blade. "Step outside." Mason's face flushed with familiar humiliation, but he obeyed. The moment he was gone, the temperature in the container seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dante studied the 3 bound men with the detached interest of someone evaluating inventory. "Gentlemen," he said pleasantly, "I apologize for my associate's enthusiasm. He sometimes confuses intimidation with motivation." The eldest of the 3 men, silver-haired, expensive watch, probably the senior accountant, cleared his throat. "Mr. Vescari, there's been a misunderstanding. The payment schedule was agreed upon, but there were complications with the transfer." "What kind of complications?" "Federal audit. Our accounts are temporarily frozen while the IRS sorts through some paperwork inconsistencies." Mara watched Dante process this information. A federal audit meant government oversight, documentation, the kind of scrutiny that made violent solutions extremely expensive. Mason's approach of physical intimidation would only attract more attention from people with badges and subpoena power. "How long?" Dante asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. "And the amount in question?" 700,000. Dante was quiet for a long moment, calculating variables that went beyond simple arithmetic. Mara could see him weighing the cost of waiting against the cost of appearing weak, the value of the money against the value of maintaining relationships that took years to build. "Bruno," he said finally, "untie them." As Bruno cut the zip ties, Dante continued speaking in the same conversational tone. "Here's what's going to happen. You have 2 weeks to resolve your audit situation. During that time, you'll pay 15% interest on the outstanding amount. Call it insurance for my patients." The silver-haired man nodded quickly. "Of course, that's very reasonable. If the audit extends beyond 2 weeks, we'll revisit the terms. But I want weekly updates, documented proof of your cooperation with federal investigators, and assurance that this situation won't repeat itself." "Understood." Dante looked at each man individually, making sure they understood the gravity of what he wasn't saying. "I'm not my father, gentlemen. I prefer solutions that don't require cleanup crews, but that preference has limits." After the Torino representatives had been escorted to their cars and driven away, Dante found Mara standing outside the warehouse, breathing the cold air like someone who'd spent too long in a confined space. "You disagree with how I handled that," he said. "It's not my place to disagree. I'm asking anyway." Mara studied his face in the sodium light. "You let them keep their dignity. That's worth more than money to men like that." "And Mason. Mason thinks respect comes from fear. You think it comes from fairness." She paused. "Both of you might be right, depending on the situation." Dante stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixing with the night air. "What do you think it comes from?" "Choice." The answer came without hesitation. "People follow you because they choose to, not because they have to. The moment someone feels trapped, they start looking for exits. Is that what you're doing, looking for exits? Mara met his gaze directly. Every day, it's what keeps me honest. And what keeps you here? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them was ready to address directly. Mara thought about her grandmother, walking without pain for the first time in years. About the safety of being valuable rather than invisible. About the strange satisfaction of using her skills for something more complex than survival. "The work," she said finally, "it's not what I expected." "What did you expect? Breaking things, hurting people, being pointed at problems and told to solve them with violence. And instead, you ask my opinion, you let me think." Mara's voice carried a note of surprise, as if she was still adjusting to the concept. "It's been a long time since anyone cared what I thought about anything." Dante nodded slowly. "Intelligence is wasted on simple violence. You're too good at this to be just muscle. This, reading situations, understanding people, seeing solutions that don't require body counts." They stood in comfortable silence, two people who'd found an unexpected partnership in the space between control and submission. But Mara could feel the boundaries clearly, invisible lines that defined what they could discuss, what they could trust each other with, how close they could get without compromising the careful balance that made their arrangement work. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. "Different warehouse, same principle." Dante's smile was almost genuine. "Welcome to the family business, Mara." As Bruno drove her back to the Nightglass Hotel, Mara realized she was beginning to understand the difference between being owned and being valued. It was a thin line, but it might be enough. The photograph arrived on Dante's desk at exactly 10 a.m., delivered by courier in an envelope bearing no return address. Black and white, high resolution, shot with a telephoto lens from across the street. Mara entering the physical therapy clinic where her grandmother received treatment, her face clear and unmistakable, despite the baseball cap pulled low over her eyes. Dante studied the image, while Bruno stood silently beside him, both men understanding immediately what they were looking at. Someone was watching. Someone knew about Mara, about Elena Bellucci, about the surgery and the weekly appointments, and the carefully constructed life that Dante had built to keep his most valuable asset stable and motivated. "How many people knew about the medical arrangements?" Dante asked. "5, counting us." Bruno's tone was flat, professional. "Dr. Chen, her surgical coordinator, the insurance liaison I used to handle the payments. And? Doctor. Chen has been treating people like us for 15 years. Never had a leak, never asked questions she didn't need answers to. The surgical coordinator is her daughter. Family business, tight security protocols." Bruno paused. "The insurance liaison is new to me. Came recommended through Mason's contacts." Dante set the photograph down carefully, as if it might explode. Mason Falco's contacts were a mixed bag of useful criminals and potential liabilities, people who sold information as readily as they sold silence. But this felt different, too precise, too well-timed, too much like a message rather than simple intelligence gathering. Who else has access to Mara's schedule? Hotel security tracks her movements automatically, keycard logs, elevator usage, entry and exit times. But that system is internal, no external access points. Bruno's fingers drummed against his leg, a rare display of tension, unless someone copied the data manually. The implications hung in the air like smoke. The Nightglass Hotel employed 63 people across 3 shifts, from executive management to overnight maintenance. Any one of them could be feeding information to interested parties, motivated by money or fear, or the simple human tendency to talk too much after a few drinks. Dante's secure phone buzzed. Text message, unknown number. Impressive fighter. Even more impressive how quickly she's adapted to civilian life. Would hate for anything to disturb such a peaceful arrangement. Bruno. Dante turned the phone so his lieutenant could read the message. Recognition. The phrasing feels European, formal, precise. Could be Balkan, could be Russian. Bruno's jaw tightened. Could be someone who knew her from before. Before. The word carried the weight of Mara's entire hidden history, the underground circuits, the disappeared identities, the reasons someone like the Iron Siren had vanished from a world where legends didn't simply retire. Dante had assumed her past was safely buried under 3 years of careful anonymity. Apparently, he'd been wrong. Options: lock her down, full security detail, restricted movements, no contact with outside world until we identify the threat. Bruno's suggestion was textbook, the kind of response that had kept Vescari family members alive for 3 generations. She won't accept that. She doesn't have a choice. Everyone has a choice. Dante stood, walking to the window that overlooked the bustling street 40 floors below. Somewhere down there, ordinary people moved through their lives without knowing that their safety depended on the decisions made in rooms like this. The question is, what happens when you take that choice away? Sir? Mara stays because she wants to stay, the moment she feels trapped. Dante remembered her words from the warehouse. People follow you because they choose to, not because they have to. The moment someone feels trapped, they start looking for exits. His phone buzzed again, this time a photograph of Nonna Elena leaving the physical therapy clinic, smiling and walking without assistance, her recovery so complete it looked like a miracle. The message that followed was simple. Beautiful progress. Would be tragic if anything derailed it. Dante felt something cold settle in his chest. Threatening him was business. Threatening Mara was personal. But threatening an innocent 73-year-old woman who'd done nothing more than love her granddaughter, that was something else entirely. Change of plans, he said quietly. We don't lock Mara down, we draw them out. Sir? Whoever sent these knows exactly what buttons to push. They understand the leverage points, the pressure that keeps our arrangement stable. Dante turned from the window, his expression harder than Bruno had seen since the funeral. Which means they've been watching for a while, learning patterns, studying weaknesses. You want to use her as bait. I want to use their certainty against them. Dante pulled out his phone, speed dialing a number. Mara, we need to talk now. 20 minutes later, she sat in the chair across from his desk, studying the photographs with the detached professionalism he'd come to expect from her. No visible emotion, no panic, just careful analysis of a problem that needed solving. Recognition? He asked. The angle suggests they were positioned in the building across from the clinic. Professional equipment. Probably a 2-person team, one watching, one ready to move if needed. She set the photos down. The timing feels like a test. Test for what? How you react when someone threatens what you value. Mara's dark eyes met his. They're not trying to hurt me or my grandmother. Not yet, they're measuring your response. And what does my response tell them? Whether you're someone who negotiates or someone who eliminates problems permanently. Mara leaned back in her chair. The question is, which one are you? Dante considered the question, weighing the kind of man his father had been against the kind of man he was trying to become. The old way would be simple. Find whoever sent the photos, make them disappear, send a message that discouraged future interference. The new way was more complicated, required patience and strategy rather than immediate violence. But looking at the photograph of Mara's grandmother, innocent and vulnerable, and walking without pain for the first time in years, Dante realized that some things transcended strategy. Both, he said quietly, depending on what they do next. And what do we do next? We make them think they're in control, right up until they realize they never were. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's Temple of Dendur glowed under carefully arranged spotlights, its ancient stones reflected in the shallow pool that surrounded the Egyptian monument like a moat of liquid light. New York's elite circulated through the soaring glass atrium, their conversations a symphony of political influence and financial power, orchestrated around champagne flutes and carefully calculated social positioning. The annual Vescari Foundation Charity Gala was theater disguised as philanthropy, a public demonstration that the family's money served legitimate purposes, that their influence extended beyond the shadows into the respectable world of museums and hospitals and scholarship funds. Tonight, however, the performance carried additional weight. Dante's first major public appearance since officially assuming control of the family's interests, with every gesture scrutinized by rivals, allies, and federal investigators who attended these events wearing expensive suits instead of badges. Mara stood 30 feet away, unrecognizable in a black evening gown that had cost more than she'd made in 6 months of cleaning hotel rooms. The designer had somehow managed to make her look elegant and dangerous simultaneously. The fabric cut to allow movement, while concealing the fact that she could disable most of the men in the room without breaking stride. Her hair was swept up in a style that took an hour to achieve and looked effortless, her makeup applied by someone who understood that the goal was enhancement rather than concealment. "Breathe," Bruno Altieri murmured beside her, his own formal wear impeccable but somehow practical, as if he'd chosen his tuxedo based on how quickly he could draw a weapon while wearing it. "You look like you're planning to kill someone." "I'm planning to kill several someones if this goes wrong," Mara replied quietly, her smile never wavering as she watched Dante navigate through clusters of donors and journalists, each conversation a delicate balance of charm and authority. The evening had proceeded smoothly until Sofia Varney arrived. Mara recognized her immediately from the research Bruno had compiled. Investigative journalist, 34, Columbia School of Journalism graduate with a specialty in organized crime connections and political corruption. Sister disappeared 3 years ago under circumstances that had never been adequately explained, leaving Sofia with the kind of personal vendetta that made her dangerous to people who preferred operating in shadows. Sofia moved through the crowd with predatory patience, her press credentials allowing access while her camera remained conspicuously absent. She wasn't here to document the charity auction or interview celebrities about their philanthropic motivations. She was hunting. "Problem," Mara said into her discreet earpiece. "Specify." Dante's voice came back immediately, his tone unchanged despite being in the middle of a conversation with 3 city council members and a federal judge. "Sofia Varney, 6 o'clock from your position. Navy dress, moving with purpose." "Acknowledged." But Sofia wasn't heading for Dante. She was coming directly toward Mara, her path calculated to create a collision near the reflecting pool where conversations carried further and cameras had better angles. "Miss Bellucci," Sofia's voice was professionally warm. The tone of someone who'd perfected the art of making questions sound like friendly observations. "I'm Sofia Varney, freelance journalist. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about your background." Mara's blood temperature dropped 10 degrees. "I think you have me confused with someone else." "Iron Siren. European underground circuit. Approximately 47 professional matches before vanishing in 2021. Sofia's smile never wavered, but her eyes held the intensity of someone who'd spent 3 years building toward this moment. Quite a career change, from prize fighting to philanthropic events. "I don't know what you're talking about. Berlin, the match against Mihai Stănescu that was supposed to be fixed, but wasn't. The promoters lost 17 million in illegal betting revenue when you refused to take a dive." Sofia stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than shouting would have. "My sister Maria was working security that night. She disappeared 2 weeks later." The connection hit Mara like a physical blow. Maria Varney, 26, bilingual, hired as temporary translation services for international fight promoters who preferred their business, conducted in languages that couldn't be easily monitored. Mara remembered her, quiet, competent, the kind of invisible efficiency that made her valuable to people who dealt in secrets. "I'm sorry for your loss," Mara said carefully, "but I think She left me a message before she disappeared. Video file hidden on a secure server." Sofia's hand moved to her purse, and Mara tensed automatically before realizing the threat wasn't physical. Facial recognition software has gotten very sophisticated in the past 3 years. Amazing what technology can identify from old surveillance footage. Around them, the gala continued its elegant choreography, donors bidding on auction items, while politicians posed for photographs that would appear in tomorrow's society pages. But in the space between Mara and Sofia, a different kind of negotiation was taking place, one that could destroy everything Dante had built, everything Mara had sacrificed her identity to protect. "What do you want?" Mara asked. "Information about the people who made my sister disappear, about the network that connects underground fighting to legitimate business interests." Sofia's smile turned predatory. About how someone like the Iron Siren ends up as arm candy at a Vescari Foundation event. You're making assumptions. I'm connecting dots. Your identity, your skills, the timing of your disappearance, the sudden improvement in Vescari family fortunes since you arrived in New York. Sophia paused, letting the implications sink in. The question is whether you're going to help me find the truth voluntarily, or whether I publish what I already know and let you explain it to federal investigators. Mara could feel eyes watching them. Security cameras, curious donors, Bruno Altieri's concerned attention from across the room. In 30 seconds, this conversation would attract the kind of notice that made people ask questions, take photographs, remember faces and names that were supposed to remain invisible. 24 hours, Sophia said, pulling a business card from her purse. Call me or read about yourself in tomorrow's headlines. As Sophia melted back into the crowd, Mara stood frozen beside the reflecting pool, watching ancient Egyptian stones shimmer under modern spotlights. Around her, New York's elite continued their performance of respectability and influence, unaware that the foundation of everything they thought they knew was about to crack open. She touched her earpiece once, a signal that meant immediate extraction. "Bruno," she whispered, "we need to leave. Now." But as she moved toward the exit, Mara caught sight of Dante across the room, still engaged in conversation with people who mattered, still playing his role in the theater of legitimate power. For the first time since accepting his offer of protection, she wondered if she'd traded one kind of cage for another, and whether the price of freedom might be higher than either of them was prepared to pay. The penthouse suite felt like a mausoleum at 3 a.m., its expensive silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic 40 floors below. Mara sat in the leather chair that faced the windows, still wearing her evening gown from the gala, her carefully styled hair now loose around her shoulders. She'd been motionless for 2 hours, watching the city lights blur and shift as her mind replayed every word of her conversation with Sophia Varney. Dante stood behind the bar, pouring whiskey he wouldn't drink while Bruno Altieri sat at the conference table with his laptop open, tracking down every connection between Sophia's investigation and their security protocols. The atmosphere was surgical. 3 professionals dissecting a problem that threatened to destroy everything they'd built. "How much does she know?" Dante asked, without looking up from the amber liquid in his glass. "Everything that matters," Mara replied. "My real identity, the timing of my disappearance, enough about the European circuit to connect me to her sister's death." She paused. "And she knows about us, about this arrangement. Speculation or evidence? Does it matter?" Mara's voice carried a flatness that Bruno recognized as dangerous. "She has enough to destroy your reputation and mine. Federal investigators would be very interested in why the Vescari family is employing a disappeared international fugitive." Dante finally turned from the bar, his expression unreadable in the dim lighting. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing, but she's not going to wait for answers." Mara stood, the movement fluid despite the restrictive dress. 24 hours, then she publishes whatever she has. "We could handle it quietly," Bruno suggested, his tone carefully neutral. "Sophia Varney has made a lot of enemies with her investigations. Journalists who dig too deep sometimes have accidents." The suggestion hung in the air like poison gas. Mara felt something cold settle in her chest. A familiar weight that reminded her why she'd walked away from the fighting world in the first place. "No," she said quietly. "It would solve the immediate problem," Bruno continued. "One accident, very tragic, very convincing. Her investigation dies with her." I said no. Mara's voice carried steel now, the tone of someone who'd drawn a line that couldn't be crossed. "We don't hurt innocent people." "She's not innocent," Dante said. "She's targeting us, threatening everything we've worked for. That makes her a legitimate threat." Mara turned to look at him directly, seeing something in his expression that made her stomach clench with recognition. This was the moment she'd been dreading since accepting his offer, the moment when his world's logic would demand she compromise the principles that had driven her to disappear in the first place. "Her sister is dead because of people like us," Mara said. "Maria Varney was in the wrong place at the wrong time, asking the wrong questions about the wrong people. Sophia isn't targeting us for money or power. She's looking for justice. Justice is a luxury we can't afford, Dante replied. Not when it threatens the safety of everyone under our protection. Everyone? Or just your business interests? The words came out sharper than Mara intended, but she couldn't take them back. 3 months of careful balance, Jeff finding middle ground between her conscience and his pragmatism, collapsed in an instant. That's not fair, Dante said. Isn't it? Mara gestured toward the windows, toward the city where her grandmother was sleeping safely in her own bed, recovering from surgery that had given her dignity and mobility back. You saved Nonna because it bought my loyalty. You employed me because I'm useful. Everything you've done has been calculated to maintain control. And everything you've done has been calculated to maintain your independence, Dante shot back. You think I don't see how you watch every exit, catalogue every weapon, plan your escape routes? You've never trusted me, not really. Trust? Mara's laugh was bitter. You want to murder a journalist whose only crime is loving her sister, enough to spend 3 years looking for answers. What part of that am I supposed to trust? The part where I'm trying to protect you. Dante's control cracked slightly, revealing something raw underneath. Sophia Varney doesn't care about justice, she cares about revenge, and she'll destroy anyone who gets in her way, including your grandmother, including you, including innocent people whose only connection to this is working for me. So your solution is to become the monster she thinks you are? My solution is to survive long enough to become something better. The honesty in his voice hit Mara like a physical blow. She could see the weight he carried, the impossible balance between his father's legacy and his own conscience, the daily choices between expedient violence and principled vulnerability. But she could also see where those choices led. I can't be part of this, she said quietly. Mara, no. She was already moving toward the door, her decision crystallizing with each step. I won't be your weapon against innocent people. I won't be the reason another woman loses someone she loves. If you walk away now, you lose everything, Dante said. The protection, the resources, your grandmother's medical care, all of it. Mara stopped at the door but didn't turn around. I've lost everything before. I survived it then. I'll survive it now. And Sophia Varney? That's not my problem anymore. Mara's hand touched the door handle. Handle it however you want, but handle it without me. You're making a mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. As the door closed behind her, Mara felt the familiar weight of solitude settling on her shoulders. In the elevator, she caught her reflection in the polished steel. A woman in an expensive dress, running away from safety toward an uncertain future. Again. But this time she was running toward something instead of away from it. The question was whether she'd have enough time to figure out what that something was before Dante's world and Sophia's investigation collided in ways that couldn't be controlled or contained. Behind her, 40 floors up, 2 men sat in expensive silence, each wondering whether they'd just lost something irreplaceable or whether they'd never really had it to begin with. The safe house in Astoria smelled like cigarettes and failure. Mara sat on the edge of a mattress that had seen better decades, counting the cash she'd withdrawn before Dante could freeze her accounts. $3,000 in small bills, enough for maybe 6 weeks if she was careful, less if she needed to run. The studio apartment was the kind of place where people disappeared deliberately, where landlords asked no questions as long as rent came in cash and tenants kept their problems to themselves. She'd been gone from the night-class hotel for 72 hours. No calls, no messages, no attempts at contact from Dante or Bruno Altieri. The silence felt deliberate, a professional courtesy that acknowledged her decision while leaving room for negotiation if circumstances changed. But Mara knew better than to mistake restraint for acceptance. Her grandmother's voice on the phone had been carefully neutral when Mara called to check on her recovery progress. Elena Bellucci was many things, but naive wasn't one of them. She understood that her granddaughter's sudden departure from her fancy hotel job probably meant trouble of the kind that didn't get discussed over telephone lines. "Are you safe, cara mia?" Nonna had asked. "Safe enough," Mara had replied, both of them knowing it was a lie wrapped in hope. The knock at her door came at midnight, 3 soft raps followed by 2 harder ones. a pattern Sophia Varney had specified when she'd left her business card at the museum. Mara checked the peephole, confirmed the identity, and opened the door to let the journalist into her temporary world of hiding. "You look different," Sophia said, studying Mara's appearance. Without makeup and designer clothes, wearing jeans and a Columbia sweatshirt she'd bought at a thrift store, Mara looked younger but somehow more substantial. "More like yourself." "I wouldn't know what that looks like anymore." Mara gestured toward the apartment's single chair, keeping the bed for herself. "You said you had information about your sister." Sophia sat carefully, her reporter's eyes cataloguing every detail of the small space. "Maria sent me files before she disappeared. Financial records, communication intercepts, surveillance footage from 3 different underground venues. Enough evidence to connect the European fighting circuit to money laundering operations across 6 countries. And your name appears in 47 different documents. Fight records, medical reports, travel manifests, bank transfers." Sophia pulled out a tablet, swiping through files with practiced efficiency. "But never as the victim. Every single reference positions you as someone who had agency, who made choices, who walked away when things got too dirty." Mara felt something shift in her chest, not quite relief, but recognition. For 3 years, she'd carried the weight of everything she'd been forced to become, everyone she'd been required to hurt, every compromise she'd made to survive in a world that treated fighters like expendable resources. To hear someone say she'd had choices, that she'd maintained some semblance of control even in the darkest moments, felt like absolution she hadn't known she needed. "Maria's disappearance," Mara said. "What really happened?" She uncovered the connection between the Berlin fight promoters and a trafficking operation. Young women from Eastern Europe, promised legitimate work, ended up in situations they couldn't escape. Sophia's voice carried the controlled rage of someone who'd spent 3 years building a case that no one wanted to prosecute. "Your fight against Mihai Stănescu was supposed to be the distraction, something big and public to draw attention while they moved their real merchandise. But I didn't take the dive. You didn't take the dive, which meant their timeline got disrupted, their window of opportunity closed, and their operation got exposed to people who preferred staying in the shadows." Sophia closed the tablet. "Maria was collateral damage in a war you didn't even know you were fighting." The weight of unintended consequences settled on Mara's shoulders like a familiar coat. How many times had her decisions rippled out in ways she couldn't predict, affecting lives she'd never know about? How many Maria Varneys had paid the price for her attempts to maintain some shred of integrity in a business built on exploitation? "Why are you telling me this?" Mara asked. "Because I spent 3 years thinking you were part of the problem. Turns out you might be part of the solution." Sophia leaned forward, her intensity filling the small room. "The trafficking network is still operating. Different promoters, different venues, same system, and they've expanded into the United States. New York? New York. The underground fighting scene here is small, but connected to some very legitimate business interests, people who could make problems disappear if they felt threatened." Sophia paused meaningfully. "People like Dante Vescari." Mara stood and walked to the single window, looking out at the industrial landscape of Queens. Somewhere across the river, Dante was probably sitting in his penthouse, making decisions about how to handle Sophia's investigation. Whether those decisions involved violence or strategy depended on variables Mara couldn't control anymore. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Information. Access. Someone who understands how these networks operate and has the skills to infiltrate them safely." Sophia joined her at the window. "I can't get justice for Maria by writing articles that prosecutors won't read, but maybe we can prevent other women from disappearing. I'm not a cop, I'm not even a good citizen." "No, but you're someone who walked away from easy money because it came with too high a moral price. That's more than most people can claim." Mara thought about Dante's offer of protection, about the safety and comfort she'd traded for principle, about her grandmother's medical bills and the uncertain future that stretched ahead of her. 3 months ago, she would have chosen security over justice without hesitation. But 3 months ago, she hadn't learned what it felt like to be valued for her mind rather than just her fists. "If I help you," she said, It can't involve Dante or his people. Whatever's happening with the trafficking network, he's not part of it. How can you be sure? Because if he was, he wouldn't have let me walk away knowing what I know. Mara turned from the window. He's many things, but he's not stupid. Sophia nodded slowly. Then we do this without involving the Vescari organization. Just us, working from the outside. Just us against a network that's been operating for years, with resources we can't match and connections we don't understand. Mara's smile was sharp as broken glass. I've had worse odds. Is that a yes? Mara looked around the safe house apartment, at the life she'd built from nothing in 72 hours, at the future she was choosing over safety and comfort. For the first time since leaving the Nightglass Hotel, she felt like herself. Not the iron siren, not Dante's asset, but someone with agency and purpose and the ability to choose what battles were worth fighting. That's a yes, she said, but we do this my way. The package arrived at Mara's safe house on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who asked no questions and expected no signatures. Inside the unmarked box, wrapped in tissue paper that probably cost more than her monthly rent, was her grandmother's engagement ring, the one Elena Bellucci had been forced to sell 2 years ago to cover medical expenses. No note, no explanation. Just the simple gold band with its modest diamond returned to where it belonged, as if 3 years of financial desperation had never happened. Mara held the ring up to the window light, watching it catch and scatter the autumn sun into fragments of possibility. Dante Vescari had many skills, but subtlety might be his greatest weapon. This wasn't an attempt to buy her loyalty, it was an acknowledgement of what she'd lost, what she'd sacrificed, and what mattered to her beyond money or protection. Her secure phone buzzed with a text from Sophia Varney. Meeting tonight. Found something big. The warehouse in Red Hook looked abandoned from the outside, its loading docks sealed with rust and neglect. But Sophia led her through a side entrance that opened onto a different world entirely, a legitimate shipping operation that processed cargo containers from Eastern European ports. Staffed by workers who spoke 4 languages and asked no questions about overtime schedules. 3 containers arrive every month, Sophia explained, consulting notes she'd typed on her phone. Always the same manifest, textiles and machine parts from Romania, always cleared through customs by the same inspector, always picked up by the same trucking company. Mara watched the night shift workers moving with the efficiency of people who'd perfected their routine through repetition. Everything looked normal, professional, exactly what a small import business should look like at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. What makes you think this is connected to the trafficking network? She asked. The timing. Maria's last email mentioned a shipping route through Red Hook. Containers that carried more than their manifests claimed. Sophia pointed toward a specific section of the warehouse where newer containers sat in neat rows. And the trucking company that handles pickup, registered to a holding company owned by Kieran Voss. The name hit Mara like ice water. Kieran Voss, executor for Don Stefano Ruggieri, the same Stefano who'd been mentioned in Dante's business dealings. If Voss was involved in trafficking, it meant the network extended directly into the territorial disputes that had been escalating throughout the city. How close is Voss to the Gallows organization? Mara asked. Close enough that attacking his operation would be considered an act of war, Sophia replied, which is why we need evidence before we move. Solid, undeniable proof that would force law enforcement to act, regardless of political pressure. They spent 3 hours documenting everything, security patterns, worker schedules, the specific containers that seemed to receive special handling. By 2 a.m., they had enough surveillance footage to establish the operation's scope, but not enough to prove criminal activity. As they prepared to leave, Mara's phone buzzed with an unknown number. There's a coffee shop on 47th Street. Neutral ground. 1 hour. Dante's voice, carefully controlled. Come alone. That's not Dante, Sophia said when Mara explained. It's a trap. No, Mara replied, studying the message timestamp. It's an apology. The coffee shop was one of those 24-hour places that served as refuge for insomniacs and shift workers, its fluorescent lighting harsh enough to discourage lingering. Dante sat in a corner booth, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of his usual expensive suits. Without the armor of formal clothing, he looked younger, more uncertain, like someone who'd been carrying weight too heavy for his shoulders. "You could have just called," Mara said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Some conversations require eye contact." Dante gestured toward the counter. "Coffee?" "I'm fine." They sat in silence for a moment, the distance between them measured in more than table space. 3 weeks since their confrontation in the penthouse. 3 weeks of parallel investigations that had led them to the same uncomfortable conclusion. "Sophia Varney is asking the right questions," Dante said finally. "I know. And you're helping her find the right answers." "I know that too." Dante's smile was rueful. "I've been trying to solve the wrong problem, focusing on protecting what I thought I'd built instead of understanding what I'd actually inherited. Meaning? Kieran Voss has been using legitimate Vescari shipping contracts to move his merchandise. Small percentages, careful timing, just enough to provide cover for his real business." Dante's jaw tightened. "My father either didn't know or chose not to know. Either way, I've been profiting from slavery." The admission hung between them like a confession in church. Mara could see the weight it carried, the way it changed everything Dante thought he understood about his position and responsibilities. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked. "Depends. Are you willing to come back long enough to help me burn it down?" "This isn't about coming back. This is about finishing something that should have been finished 3 years ago." Dante nodded slowly. "Partners then, not employer and employee. Partners with very different skill sets and very different stakes, but the same goal." Mara thought about her grandmother's ring, currently sitting in a place of honor on Elena's nightstand, about Sophia's determination to find justice for her sister, about the young women who were probably crossing the Atlantic in shipping containers right now, carrying hope that would be systematically destroyed by people who saw them as inventory. "Same goal," she agreed. "But we do this without anyone else getting hurt. No Mason Falco solutions, no Bruno Altieri efficiency. We expose the network and let legitimate law enforcement handle the arrests. And if Voss decides to handle the problem with violence," Mara's smile was sharp enough to cut glass, "then he'll discover that some problems fight back." Dante extended his hand across the table. Not a gesture of dominance or control, but an offer of partnership between equals. When Mara shook it, she felt something shift between them, a recognition that they were stronger together than apart. "When do we start?" he asked. "We already started. The question is whether we're smart enough to finish it before someone else decides to finish us." The Gallows Foundation charity auction was scheduled for Thursday evening at the Nightglass Hotel, a calculated irony that Don Stefano Ruggieri had orchestrated as both public legitimization and private insult. Using Dante's family venue to celebrate his own ascension to power, while Kieran Voss managed logistics and security, was the kind of theatrical dominance that organized crime families had perfected over generations. Mara studied the hotel's blueprints spread across Sophia's coffee table, each floor mapped with the precision of someone who'd spent months invisible in its corridors. 3 days to gather evidence, coordinate with federal investigators, and position themselves for a confrontation that would end with handcuffs rather than body bags. "The containers arrive tomorrow morning," Sophia said, checking her surveillance notes. "Same pattern as always, through Red Hook, cleared by the same customs inspector, picked up by Voss's trucking company. But this time we'll be ready," Dante added, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone who'd learned to plan for war instead of simply reacting to it. "FBI surveillance team positions here, here, and here." He marked the warehouse diagrams with red ink. "Immigration and Customs Enforcement handles the shipping manifest investigation." Bruno Altieri stood near the window, his usual composed efficiency replaced by something sharper, more personal. Discovering that his family's legitimate business had been used as cover for human trafficking had affected him in ways that went beyond professional concern. The betrayal felt intimate, not just of the Vescari name, but of principles he'd thought they shared. "Voss's security team will be split between the warehouse and the hotel," Bruno said. "He can't protect both locations effectively. which means he'll have to choose where to make his stand. He'll choose the hotel, Mara said with certainty. Maximum visibility, maximum legitimacy. Surrounded by politicians and journalists who provide natural cover, she traced evacuation routes with her finger. But that also means maximum exposure when everything falls apart. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Let the trafficking operation proceed exactly as scheduled, but ensure that every step was documented by federal agents equipped with warrants, surveillance equipment, and coordination with international law enforcement. No violence, no dramatic confrontations, just the methodical application of legal pressure until the entire network collapsed under the weight of evidence. Sophia's investigation had provided the foundation, Dante's inside knowledge had filled the gaps, and Bruno's logistical expertise had made it operationally feasible. But success depended on precise timing and the assumption that Voss would prioritize reputation over operational security. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of grey October sky that made shadows deeper and decisions more difficult. The Red Hook warehouse hummed with normal activity, while federal agents in unmarked vehicles documented everything from angles that would stand up in court. 3 shipping containers from Romania, processed through customs with paperwork that looked legitimate until examined by people who knew what questions to ask. Mara watched from a rooftop across the street, using binoculars that Bruno had requisitioned from sources he didn't specify. Through the lenses, she could see the careful choreography of crime disguised as commerce, workers who moved with military precision, supervisors who carried weapons instead of clipboards, trucks that departed immediately instead of following normal delivery schedules. "Container 3 is moving," she reported into her secure radio. 2 vehicles, heading toward Manhattan. "Confirmed?" came Sophia's voice from her position near the FBI surveillance van. "Federal agents are maintaining distance, tracking GPS signals on the trucks. The real confrontation would happen at the Night Glass Hotel, where Don Stefano Ruggieri's charity auction was already attracting the kind of guests who expected their attendance to be photographed and their donations to be publicly celebrated. Legitimate businessmen, politicians who needed campaign contributions, journalists who covered society events rather than serious crime, exactly the audience that would make arrests spectacular rather than secretive. Dante had positioned himself in the hotel lobby, playing the role of gracious host, while maintaining communication with law enforcement coordinators positioned throughout the building. His father's old venue was about to become the stage for the kind of public justice that Antonio Viscari had spent his lifetime avoiding. At 7:30 p.m., as guests filled the ballroom and Kieran Voss supervised security arrangements that felt more like military deployment, the shipping trucks arrived at the hotel's service entrance. That's when everything accelerated beyond anyone's ability to control. The federal agents moved with the precision Sophia had requested, simultaneous raids on the warehouse, the shipping trucks, and the hotel's service areas where human cargo was being processed for transport to auction venues that existed in the shadows, between legitimate business and criminal enterprise. Voss's security team found themselves surrounded by people with badges, warrants and surveillance footage that documented 3 years of systematic trafficking. No shots fired, no dramatic chases, just the inexorable machinery of justice applied by investigators who'd spent months building cases that prosecutors couldn't refuse. In the ballroom, Don Stefano Ruggieri continued his speech about charitable giving and community responsibility, unaware that his primary lieutenant was being arrested 2 floors below. The irony was perfect. A man who built his reputation on controlling information, brought down by information he'd never thought to control. Mara watched from the hotel's security office, surrounded by monitors that showed federal agents in every corridor, as Dante walked calmly onto the ballroom stage to make an announcement that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority that came from choosing truth over convenience, "I have some important information to share about tonight's charity auction and the business practices it was intended to legitimize." The silence that followed was the sound of a world shifting on its axis, of secrets becoming evidence, of power built on exploitation finally meeting accountability. Through the security monitors, Mara could see Kieran Voss in handcuffs, surrounded by federal agents and evidence that would ensure his conviction. Don Stefano Ruggieri, being escorted from the ballroom by investigators who'd spent 3 years building a case against his trafficking network, and Sofia Varney, finally able to publish the story that would bring justice for her sister and hundreds of other women whose names she'd never know. It was over. Not with violence, but with truth. Not with death, but with consequences. Not with revenge, but with justice that came slowly but inevitably, like tide returning to shore. Mara touched her earpiece one final time. "All clear," she said. "Target neutralized through legal channels." For the first time in 3 years, the Iron Siren could rest. 6 months later, the Nightglass Hotel had been reborn under new management that emphasized transparency over secrecy, legitimate business over shadow operations. The federal investigation had cleared the Vescari family of direct involvement in trafficking, but the scrutiny had forced changes that went deeper than cosmetic renovation. Mara stood in the gym on the 10th floor, watching Bruno Altieri work through combinations on the heavy bag with the methodical precision that characterized everything he did. His technique was improving, less mechanical, more intuitive, as if he'd finally learned to trust his instincts rather than just following protocols. "Dante wants to see you," Bruno said without stopping his rhythm. "Penthouse office when you're ready." "Is that a request or a summons? With you, is there a difference?" The question carried weight they both understood. In 6 months of rebuilding, Mara had established herself as something between consultant and partner, someone whose advice Dante sought, but whose independence he respected. The relationship had evolved beyond employer and employee, beyond protector and protected, into something more complicated and more honest. The penthouse office looked different now, less like a fortress, more like a place where actual business happened. Natural light replaced harsh overhead lighting, and the walls displayed photographs of legitimate construction projects instead of abstract art that suggested nothing about the man who worked there. Dante stood at the windows, but this time he was looking at blueprints spread across a drafting table instead of studying the city-like territory to be conquered. Urban renewal projects, low-income housing developments, community centers that would serve neighborhoods that had been neglected by people who treated poverty as someone else's responsibility. "The Ferrante Community Center breaks ground next month," he said without turning around. "Full athletic facilities, educational programs, job training initiatives." He paused. Elias Ferrante agreed to oversee the boxing program. Mara felt something shift in her chest. Elias Ferrante, the man who'd trained her, expelled her, and ultimately helped her understand the difference between fighting for survival and fighting for purpose. If Dante had reached out to him, it meant more than charity. It meant understanding. "He's a good choice," she said. "He suggested you might be interested in teaching. Young women, specifically. Self-defense, discipline, confidence." Dante finally turned from the blueprints. "The kind of skills that help people protect themselves without becoming victims." "And what did you tell him?" "That it's your choice to make." The words carried weight that went beyond the immediate offer. For 6 months they'd worked together as equals, building something that honored the past while refusing to be trapped by it. But every partnership eventually reached a crossroads where the participants had to decide whether they were building something temporary or something permanent. "There's something else," Dante continued. "Sofia Varney's investigation won 3 journalism awards. She's starting a foundation focused on trafficking prevention, international cooperation, victim advocacy." He gestured toward a folder on his desk. "She asked if you'd be interested in consulting on security issues, helping other survivors develop the skills they need to stay safe." Mara picked up the folder, scanning through proposals that represented years of work, systematic approaches to problems that required more than individual solutions. Sofia had taken her sister's death and transformed it into something that could prevent other families from experiencing the same loss. "What about you?" Mara asked. "What happens to all this?" She gestured toward the office. The hotel. The legitimate empire that Dante was building from the ruins of his father's legacy. "It continues, but differently." Dante's smile was more genuine than she'd seen from him in their earliest days. "Turns out running a legal business is more challenging than I expected. Requires different skills, different partnerships, different partners, better partners." The admission hung between them, honest and complicated. They'd found something together that neither had expected, not romance in any traditional sense, but recognition, understanding, the kind of partnership that came from facing impossible choices and choosing each other's better angels. "Nonna wants to meet you properly," Mara said finally. "Not as my employer, not as someone doing business with her granddaughter, just as someone she'd like to know." "I'd like that." "Sunday dinner, 7 o'clock. She cooks. You listen to stories about my childhood. Everyone pretends this is normal." Dante's laugh was surprised and genuine. "Is it normal?" "I wouldn't know. I've never tried normal before." "Neither have I." Mara looked around the office one more time, at the evidence of lives being rebuilt and choices being made for reasons that had nothing to do with fear or necessity. Through the windows, New York sprawled in all its complicated glory, millions of people making millions of decisions, most of them small, some of them world-changing. "The community center position," she said. "Does it come with health insurance? Full benefits, vacation time, retirement planning?" Dante's expression was carefully neutral. Everything a legitimate employee would expect. "And the consulting work with Sophia's foundation? Flexible schedule, travel as needed. Coordination with law enforcement agencies that prefer their consultants to have clean records and community ties." Mara nodded slowly, understanding that he was offering her something she'd never had, a future that belonged to her, built on choices rather than circumstances, anchored in purpose rather than survival. "I'll need time to train replacements," she said. "For what?" "For whatever part of me you thought you needed." Mara's smile was sharp and warm simultaneously. "Turns out I'm better at building things than breaking them. I was hoping you'd say that." Outside the windows, the sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of possibility. Somewhere in the city, Elena Bellucci was preparing dinner for 3 instead of 1, humming while she worked because her granddaughter had finally found something worth staying for. Somewhere else, Sophia Varney was writing stories that would change laws and save lives and honor her sister's memory with action rather than grief. And here, 40 floors above the street, 2 people who'd learned to trust each other were choosing to build something together, not perfect, not simple, but real in all the ways that mattered. "Sunday dinner," Dante said. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself. Nonna does the rest. And after dinner, we figure out what comes next." For the first time in 3 years, Mara Bellucci was looking forward to finding out. Hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe so you don't miss more like this. Hit like and tell me in the comments what you thought. See you in the next video.